Thank you so much, Ms. Monica Bradley, for that beautiful introduction. And I would just like to say, Monica, we are so proud of the work that you're doing here at Brite as our Director of Admissions. Today is Monica's brainchild, and she has been tenaciously just working toward recruiting students and making Brite more well-known in various communities. So, Monica, we're so grateful for you to be at Brite, and we're so proud of the work that you're doing. So congratulations just on everything that you've achieved so far and the admissions team that you lead. Also, thank you so much to our student Zane Freemeyer for that beautiful prayer today. And as always, Deshae, we are always in awe of your giftedness and the way that you serve still your Brite community, even though you have graduated and moved on up. We're grateful to have you back. So today is just such a phenomenal day, not only because it is HBCU Day and we are celebrating trans lives and LGBTQ plus persons, but as an ally, I am so grateful to stand before you today and to preach for just a few moments on a subject that I had just meditated on and thought about, and I came to the conclusion that marginalization and disenfranchisement is not only limited to the LGBTQ community, it is also disproportionately affecting Black Americans. As you know, I have lived experience, and I'm sure that Monica has lived experience of racism and sexism and the things that pervade this world. And so today I would like to invite you to center your hearts and your minds around the idea that we will be great nations. And this is in reference to Hagar and Ishmael. I will be reading just an excerpt from Genesis 21, chapters or verses 8 through 20. However, I will be focusing on just a small portion. So I just invite you now to just listen and just allow your hearts to meditate. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness, and he became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Throughout history, God has always been known to reveal God's plans to God's people. When we study biblical texts, we can observe God revealing what is to come, years, sometimes decades from now. These acts are not only reserved for kings, priests, seers, or prophets. God also reveals God's plans to those who are victims of the times and conditions in which they live, such as those who have been subjected to enslavement. Hagar is an example. Hagar was an Egyptian woman who wrestled with the act of submission to Abraham and Sarah, or Sarai. Or, as I might imagine, she was wrestling with submitting to anyone. She was feisty, to say the least. She held herself with high regard, and I can picture her giving Abraham and Sarah the side eye constantly. If I could, I would spend today talking about this African woman's strength and resilience. I would spend this time preaching about this bold woman who named God El Roy. But I will save that sermon for another day. God had plans for Hagar, and those plans far transcended her current circumstance. And at first, it might be confusing that God's angel would tell her to go back to a situation that was demeaning and deeply challenging for her. After all, she'd gotten away from Abraham and Sarah, and her circumstance showed no promise of change had she stayed. However, it is in those situations, and in that particular situation, that God's plans would be manifested. It was because Hagar was forced to live in service to Abraham and Sarah that one of the most magnificent things the Israelites and countless others came to witness: the birth of Ishmael. Ishmael, Abraham's first son and beloved Islamic prophet. Yes, that one. Ishmael, known and revered in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Ishmael, the father of 12 tribes: Nebayot, Kedar, Adbael, Mismay, Dumay, Masay, Hadad, Timeh, Yetur, Nephis, and Kadimeh. When God promised Hagar that God would make a great nation of Ishmael, God's words ought not to be downplayed. For truly, it was from this discarded and forgotten African boy that a great nation descended. As much as their society looked down upon both Hagar and Ishmael, that did not stop God's plans for the greatness that was birthed through them. As much as many who lived among them somehow thought of them to be less valuable, their closed-mindedness was no match for God's work. Although they were sent out into the wilderness and discarded by humanity, God never discarded them or left them. Because of their world's view of them as dispensable, their lives were filled with bruises and sadness and hardship and pain and suffering. Yet, still, none of those things mattered. They would never know that so many years later, you and I would be here in this Carr chapel on this morning celebrating them and their contributions to the world. Some may lean on the understanding that God made the promise to make a great nation of Ishmael simply because of his father, Abraham. I tend to think differently, and I celebrate God's intimate revelation to Hagar personally. God knew that Hagar was strong-willed, not easily discouraged, and a survivor. She knew God personally, and she trusted in God's revelation and ability to do exactly as God promised. But can you just imagine what it must have been like for Hagar? She was forced to live as a slave and ultimately was exiled into the wilderness. When the food and the water Abraham sent her and her son out into the desert with was depleted, it's understandable that she would give up hope. It's understandable that she would have felt deep despair and given up all hopes of any future. And then what's even more dire is that she had to look at her little boy and watch him as he was starving and dying of thirst right in front of her. With all these odds stacked up against her, I can understand her thinking that there was no other way. But the hurt and the betrayal and the hopelessness she must have felt in that moment, I can certainly understand. The good news is that in these moments that we are not alone, and God experiences our despair and pain alongside us. In these moments, God looks at the desperate situations we are in and freely gives hope and shows us that things are never as they seem. Situations may look impossible, but God is a God of turning impossibilities into possibilities. God is a God who sees and feels it when the world mistreats those who do not look like those who wield the power. God is a God who loves freely, and even in the darkest nights and in the hopelessness of corners and looking upon those who have privilege and who have access, God still says, this is not the end for you. No, God boldly declares that God is not confined to the views and perceptions of humanity. God is not confined to the ways of this world. No, instead, God sees the dominant narrative and uses us to create a new narrative and to do a new thing. You see, there's a lesson to be learned about the power of God's people who the world discards, mistreats, abuses, and marginalizes. There's a lesson we can take from God's promises to God's disenfranchised people, even when the world does not see our value. God's promise to both Hagar and Ishmael was fulfilled. But not only was that fulfilled, but the time in waiting, as many of us often find ourselves in, was also filled with love and God's provision. Although Ishmael grew up in the wilderness, God made sure he would survive. God made sure that he was equipped to deal with the harsh elements of the wilderness. I can't imagine what it's like to live out with bears and wild animals and so forth and so on. But Ishmael lived through it. He was an expert with the bow, an essential survival skill that he needed in order to live and to thrive. You see, God thinks things out to the T. God leaves no detail overlooked. God makes sure that whatever work God starts in us, whatever promise God makes to us, that God will do everything to make sure that that promise is brought to fulfillment. It doesn't matter how many times people might say no. It doesn't matter how many times we are discarded and sent out into our personal wildernesses. God will make sure that God's promise is brought to life. God's words to Hagar set into motion into the atmosphere the birth of the 12 tribes that our Islamic siblings revere and celebrate. The same way that God was ever so faithful to Hagar and Ishmael, God is faithful to you and me. I truly believe that God has a plan and a promise for each of us. For marginalized persons like Black, Indigenous people of color, and our LGBTQ siblings, it may seem impossible for great things to be birthed through us. With systemic structures designed to ensure we will not survive, we often cry out to God, God, how can I be great with all of the odds stacked up against me? God, I know that you tell me that I am also beautifully made in your image, and you've called me to not only be great, but give life to greatness. But how can I when this world sees me as dispensable? How can I when violent acts against our bodies are enacted every single day? How can I, God, when I don't see another path, when all I see around me is death, destruction, and violence and hatred? How can I, God? And for those who are our allies in this life and this work that God is doing, I can also imagine you saying, how can I be an ally for those who are marginalized? How can I do this work, God, when I am also not welcomed into some spaces? Well, the good news is that God has still called each of us. God has still called each of us to do unique world, to make this world just, and to recreate a world in which isms, the racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, classism, elitism, and all the isms cease to exist. All of these things manifest themselves in our lives on a daily basis. They are in our classrooms. They are in our workplaces. They are in our churches. They are everywhere in the world. But it doesn't matter when we think about the vastness of God's love and the vastness of God's ability to do a new thing. The hatred in this world is palpable, and it sickens us. And as we observe the Transgender Day of Remembrance on November 20th, we will once again hurt alongside our trans siblings. We will mourn the lives of the reported 32 trans persons who have already been killed from acts of hatred and violence. And an even greater atrocity is that the number is far greater than 32. And on a day like today, in which we honor HBCUs, we must also take note that the majority of trans lives that are lost are persons of color. Rather than continuing to cry in pain and wonder how the world can continue to be this way, I choose to work toward the creation of a new world. I choose to imagine a world in which Transgender Day of Remembrance does not exist. I choose to call out homophobia and racism when they rear their ugly heads. Most importantly, I choose to honor God's promise to do great things through me, regardless of whether that work is recognized in my lifetime or beyond me. I know that the seeds that I'm planting today and my life's work will transcend me, that my words and that my work in this world will make great nations to come. I choose to believe that despite all odds, despite the isms and despite the phobias, we all will give birth to great nations. That we can only imagine what God has for us and how God will use us in these transcendent ways. But I'm excited about the possibility. I'm excited to know that regardless of it all, that I stand alongside all siblings in the world, and we together will move forward and to create this world anew. We do not know what challenges will appear. We don't know what obstacles we will have to overcome, situations we will have to survive like Ishmael. What we do know is that God is with us. We do know that we are called to embrace the persons that God has made us to be and to consistently breathe life into the things that we are birthed with and will become pregnant with. We know that we are God's people, and as God's people, we are survivors. We know that the work is not easy. We know that spaces like this space and HBCUs are safe spaces for marginalized persons, and we need to be strategic and intentional about uplifting them and funding them. The world has yet to experience the greatness that will come through us and come from us. But I trust and believe that it is great. I trust and believe that because of you and because of me, this world will see great nations. In fact, I believe that we will be great nations. Just as Ishmael made great nations, I believe that we will also make great nations in this world. And if you'll join me today in just believing and trusting that the work and the nations that we will build will far exceed our lineages and far exceed us, you shall rejoice and you shall be glad in today, because this is a day that God has made, and it is a day that I believe is intentional in imagining and being encouraged and being inspired to continue the work, to not give up when challenges present themselves, but yet go another way, go around, go underneath, however we need to do, however we need to go. Be encouraged today to go forward and to make great nations, for we will be great nations. Amen.